Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. This is a special CFAR Biostatistics and Epidemiology core talk. Thanks to Joel Wertheim for coming. Today, Joel is in the Division of Medicine at University of California, San Diego. And he is an evolutionary biologist by training and has made his foray into public health through doing a lot of work on HIV. He developed the HIV Trace program under Sergei Kosakevsky Pont. I was trying to pronounce that name earlier. I'm just doing a terrible job at it. And the HIV Trace program is being widely implemented by the CDC and health departments nationwide to understand the molecular epidemiology of HIV. So thanks again to Joel for coming here, and we're looking forward to your talk.
I didn't know the Windows command. That was very helpful. Thank you for just coming out today, Kate, for inviting me and giving me an extra day on the East Coast. I was here for an ethics meeting yesterday down at NIH, and I was very pleased to come up and visit with all of you today. So I'm going to speak about the molecular epidemiology of HIV in the United States, and I really pared down the introduction of this talk because it's a CFAR, and I don't need to convince anyone in this room that HIV is still a big deal, with the District of Columbia and Maryland topping CDC's list of lifetime HIV risk diagnosis. But of course, New York City and New York State are also very high up on this list, and that's where our work will be focused. And if you just concentrate on New York City, of course, it's going to be a much higher risk group than the entire state. So there are about 10 million people living in New York City, and over 126,000 of them are living with HIV/AIDS. And that's the study population that we'll be concerned with today. To give you just a brief overview, we're going to start with the social and genetic networks of HIV transmission, and then I'll move on to talk a little bit about predicting HIV transmission cluster growth, then move on to drug resistance, and then finally I'll share with you some work that we've been doing on behalf of the CDC developing Secure HIV Trace to let you know what's going on in the public health department with HIV molecular epidemiology. So molecular epi is the use of HIV molecular sequence data to understand the spread of disease and to facilitate its prevention. And for HIV, these molecular data are extremely plentiful at CDC. We have over 500,000 HIV sequences reported to public health departments around the US and then reported to the federal government. In New York City, we have over 150,000 HIV sequences from what's now about 87,000 individuals. These numbers go up every 3 months when I get a new frozen data set. So we have a lot of data, which means we can ask some very interesting and sensitive questions. So for those of you who have never looked at HIV up close, this is it. Okay, well, this is how I see HIV. It's just A's, T's, G's, and C's, about 9,000 of them. And for this entire talk, we're actually only going to focus on this little region. This is protease and a small or a large chunk of reverse transcriptase. This is 1,200 nucleotides. And pretty much everything I'm going to present today, all the molecular analysis, is based only on these 1,200 nucleotides. It's kind of amazing what we can do with them. So HIV genetic sequence has been remarkably informative. It's told us where HIV-1 group M has come from, a community of chimpanzees in eastern Cameroon. We also know that multiple other introductions of HIV into the US from gorillas, from sooty mangabeys. We can count over a dozen separate introductions, and all of this comes from genetic sequence analysis. Genetic sequence analysis has also helped us trace the spread of HIV around the world out of the DRC and through Haiti into the US, and then also into the rest of sub-Saharan Africa and spreading through Asia, and then these repeated transmission events throughout the world. It's really cool work. It's not what I'm focusing on today. What we're interested in today is what's happening currently, these very sort of recent transmission events, not historical events, but we want to understand the recent patterns of HIV transmission. And to do that, we use a program called HIV Trace, which now is published. We've been using this program for 5-6 years, and we just finally managed to write it up and codify it. So for those of you who are looking to reference it, it's now been accepted at MBE. And it's our transmission cluster engine for understanding the molecular epidemiology of HIV. Now, the methods behind HIV Trace, and I'm really going to try not to go into bioinformatic details today because that's not the purpose of this talk. But we take all of our 85,000 sequences and we do pairwise codon alignment to a reference sequence, HXB2, the original HIV strain, or sequence, I should say. And then we do pairwise genetic distance between all sequences. Essentially, for every pair in that 85,000, we ask how many substitutions does each strain differ by. And then we identify potential transmission partners. Those are pairs of sequences whose genetic distance falls below a given threshold, in this case, usually 1.5% genetic distance. And then we assemble molecular transmission clusters by connecting these potential transmission partners. So, and all we're essentially asking is, do they have similar genetic sequence or not? And we can do all sorts of things with this tool. And this, I can't give a talk without putting up this figure. This was from the global transmission network of HIV-1, where we took all publicly available sequences in Los Alamos database, colored them by country, and made this modern art that you see here. Actually, reviewer 2 called it modern art and said we should remove it. The journal said, keep it in and we'll put it on the cover. So, lesson learned. So we can use our approach on extremely large data sets. At the time, we thought about 80,000 sequences was as big as you could get, and then the federal government started collecting all their sequences in a single place. So we can use HIV sequences to approximate the true transmission history. In blue, you see true transmission from a heterosexual cohort in Scandinavia, and then you can infer the genetic sequence on the right in red, and you can see that those topologies look the same. And this is seminal work by Thomas Leitner from 1996. But as Tom Leitner's group continued to remind us, even recently, that just because the trees look a certain way, that doesn't mean that that is actually the order of transmission. But it does tell us something more than random. But we can't say A infected B and B infected C just from the molecular sequence. So I'd like to try and figure out how informative molecular epidemiology is in a surveillance setting. And to do that, we went to New York City and we compared the social and genetic transmission networks of HIV-1. So New York City, when someone is diagnosed, they interview all newly diagnosed infections, index cases, and they elicit partner names at sexual and injection drug-using partners from the last 12 months. And these individuals are notified of their HIV exposure and offered HIV testing. Between 2006 and 2012, this field services unit interviewed 756 index cases who named 586 unique HIV-positive partners with available genotypes for a total of 1,342 cases. They also named some of the other index cases. So 2 index cases may have named each other, and they're not included in that additional named partners. And so we looked at the genetic distance separating these 1,300 named partners. And we saw that the genetic distances fit into 2 or maybe 3 modes. And the first mode are these individuals I've colored here in blue. Now, these are individuals whose genetic distance is less than about 2%, and we think that they represent potential transmission partners. Those are sexual or injection drug use partners whose genetic data sequences are so similar as to imply, well, we think a direct or indirect epidemiological connection. But another half of those named named partners who identified an HIV-positive partner, their viral genetic distance fell into this mode. Now, this between about 4 and 8% genetically diverged sequence is comparable to what you would find if you went into Baltimore or New York City or New Jersey or really anywhere in the United States and picked 2 people with an HIV sequence, and you said, how divergent are they? They're going to fall into this mode. So about half the people of the named HIV positive partners in New York City had had viruses that were essentially random genetic diversions from each other. And then we get this tail out here, who are people who named HIV-infected partners who were infected with different subtypes. So that's someone who has HIV-1 group M subtype B names a sexual partner who is infected with subtype C. So clearly these are not potential transmission partners, but I believe that they did have sex and they're both HIV positive, but the molecular network would tell us that they're not related. So then we went and we took the genetic data and we mapped it onto the named partner network. And you can see here it shaded all of the genetic, all of the named partners who are genetically related to their named partner. And then we did the same thing. And then we took the genetic data and we saw that 48% of transmissions implied by naming were supported by the genetic data, which sounds really good. But that means 52% of these naming events were not associated with transmission. So that means at least half of HIV positive named partners are not transmission partners. And that was surprising to the public health department. Then we did the opposite. And we took the partner naming data and we mapped that over the genetic network. And we found out that 53% of the genetic links were supported by partner naming, which means 47% of the genetic links are not supported by partner naming. And at first glance, that would seem to suggest that partner naming and genetic data are pretty much equivalent. You have 53% and 48%. But I think what we're dealing with here is an evidence of absence versus an absence of evidence. This 48% we can think of as a maximum, because the 52% who were not genetically similar, they are not transmission partners. We've compared them, we've compared the genetic distance, and they are not genetically related. This 53% we think is absence of evidence because they named transmission partners, but they only gave us names for people in the last 12 months, and it's very likely, given that someone's going to name only on average a half of a partner per interview, that they didn't name all of their partners. So we consider this 53% to be a lower bound on the proportion of genetic links that represent potential transmission events or imply, as we like to say, a direct or indirect epidemiological connection. Yes?
Do you mind an interruption?
No?
So couldn't you say the same about the top, that you don't sequence every virus the person has had?
That's true. So, but our genetic distance threshold is sufficiently permissive that should cover many, many years of potential.
We've all seen cases where you know there's been a superinfection, there's been replacement.
Oh, yes. So superinfection with replacement, we will miss using this approach.
So I'm just saying that you could say the same in both camps.
Yeah, we don't, I mean, given that these are sexual partners within the last 12 months.
I'm just saying that's not an upper bound on the genetic linkage.
Yes, if they're super infected, they could, we would miss that and that would increase as well.
Right.
Yeah. So.
You're probably going to get into it, but is there a difference in the transmission by risk group? So MSM, IDU, heterosexual?
Yes. I don't have that slide today, but yeah, so MSM are far less likely to be genetically linked to their named partner than heterosexuals. MSM about in the under 50%, whereas actually closer to 40%, and then heterosexual men and women are going to be genetically linked to their named partner about 70% of the time. And if we look at the reciprocal naming, where index identifies partner and then partner is interviewed and represents index, for heterosexual men and women, it's like 98% of them are genetically linked. So there's a substantial difference by risk factor. By race ethnicity, we see a slight difference, but I think a lot of that corresponds to risk factor as well. And that table's been published. I just don't remember the details offhand. So I think from this we can conclude that genetic data are at least as good, but we think certainly better than partner tracing for inferring transmission partners, and that given the limited resources, genetic networks do represent a relatively easy and inexpensive route to reconstructing transmission history. Running HIV trace is easy, and compared with partner services interviews, our salaries are very low, and so is all the infrastructure. But of course, this doesn't diminish the importance of partner tracing, because we still think that if someone is interviewed and they identify a partner who's not genetically linked, well, now we found a new part of the transmission network, and that's also important to public health. So moving on, we looked at the growth of molecular transmission networks in New York City, and we know that molecular data can tell us something, but it doesn't answer whether we should be using molecular epi to direct public health action. So that's been used. Many of you have seen this, where a transmission cluster was identified in British Columbia. They prioritized and did enhanced cluster investigation on the drug-resistant part of this cluster and prevented its growth for about a year of follow-up. And this sort of has been guiding, telling us that it can be done, but we still don't know whether it's worthwhile to do. And part of the reason for that is because we're not really sure if these clusters are meaningful or if they just represent sort of artifacts in the transmission phylogeny of HIV, and whether these are just artifacts masquerading as growing clusters. So just because they're big doesn't mean they're important, or the biggest fear we have is all of our previous work just artifactual. And that's motivating a lot of the work we're doing in New York City right now. So in HIV, we've had mandatory genotype reporting since 2005 in New York City, with about 2,500 new cases a year. So we analyzed the first genotype of all cases reported through mid-2007 with demographic metadata, found 3,600 clusters, 22% of cases clustered, although this number is much higher for recently diagnosed cases, where it approaches around 50%. So we get a lot higher clustering in the last, say, 5-6 years. And we go and we build our transmission network. Here blue is MSM, red is heterosexual, and green are people who inject drugs. So you can see it's predominantly an MSM network, but we do have a lot of heterosexual clusters, and we have some very, very large MSM clusters. So the first and simplest question we could ask is cluster growth predictive of cluster growth? So we took the number of new cases every year and the number of clusters every year and asked how many cases were added to the cluster in 2007, and how does that predict how many cases would be added to that same cluster in 2008, 2009, 2010. And we did that, and we can see that we get a fairly reasonable R squared between 0.2 and 0.4. So there is some signal for past cluster growth predicting future cluster growth. So that's good. That suggests to us that perhaps this isn't entirely artifactual. But of course, we're not adjusting for anything like cluster size here. And really, in a surveillance setting, we're not really interested in whether or not, clusters versus size 2 versus size 3 versus size 4. We're really interested in finding the priority clusters. So can we identify essentially those top 500 cases? And is that tip going to give rise disproportionately to future cases? Because these 500 cases is perhaps where we could focus public health resources. So we compared different methods of prioritization, targeting either nodes or clusters that can identify those priority cases, and to see if those priority cases give rise to more new genetically linked infections in the following 12 months. So first we started by picking 500 random nodes, and here's a distribution of 1,000 permutations of that. And on average, they'll give rise to about 0.01 new cases per node in the following year. This is baseline. This is the null expectation, where if you were to just pick random cases, can we do better than that? The answer is, well, yes. We could pick random clusters. So that's people who are clustered in the network versus random nodes, and these clusters add substantially and significantly more cases than random nodes. But it has a weird behavior where it decreases over time. And what this tells us is that in 2007, a random cluster in the network was much more predictive of cluster growth than a random cluster in the network in 2015. And that's because we have a lot more clusters in 2015 than we did in 2007. So we need to find a way to figure out in this period what clusters are predictive. So the first thing we did is we said, okay, New York City goes out on every recently diagnosed case. How much better are they at predicting future cluster growth than random? And they are significantly better. Here's our 500 recently diagnosed cases every month, and the number of nodes added per case, and it's better than random nodes, but not better than random clusters. Then we did some fancy machine learning where we took all of our surveillance data and we use that to build a prediction model of adding a new case in the next year, and then we use that to predict which cases to target. And we can see that that does pretty well. It does better than random nodes and sometimes better than random clusters, but there definitely is something changes in the model around 2011 and it becomes substantially less predictive. I don't know what changed in 2011. We haven't gone to investigate that. So what about the biggest clusters? Well, like my colleagues were worried about, the biggest clusters are kind of artifacts. So in the very beginning in 2007, your biggest clusters were highly predictive of cluster growth. But in 2014, your biggest clusters are essentially lumbering giants that they're still clusters, but they've exhausted the potential for spread, and they start to do worse than random clusters. So there's substantial decrease over time, and you're still better than random nodes because you're clustered, but you're worse than random clusters. So just because you see a cluster of 150 people does not mean that it's the priority, and in fact, probably means the opposite. What about just cluster growth? How many people were added this year? How many people were added last year? We're better than random. Okay, so we're finally getting somewhere useful. So we can beat random clusters by saying how many people are added this cluster in the last year. But we're still getting this decline over time. So then we thought, okay, what we really need to concentrate on is relative cluster growth. It's how many people were added relative to the size of the cluster or relative to the square root of the size of the cluster, because if a cluster of size 10 doubles and a cluster of size 3 doubles, I want the cluster of size 10 that doubled. And proportional, square proportional growth is going to give that to you. There's nothing fancier about it than that. So essentially this tells us that we need to concentrate on relative cluster growth, and also that cluster growth and relative cluster growth is more informative than all of the demographic surveillance data put together in our fancy machine learning model. So that tells us that past cluster growth does predict future cluster growth, that demographic and risk data are better than random at predicting future cases, so surveillance isn't a waste of time, and I think we all knew that already. But past cluster growth is better than demographics at predicting future cases, and that when we consider proportional growth, that further improves those predictions, which is exciting. Because I would say, based on this, I don't think cluster and cluster growth are artifactual. I think I'm convinced from this. But that doesn't mean that we should just unleash molecular epidemiology on the United States, because cluster growth, I'm just saying new nodes added to the network. Now that's not distinguishing between cluster growth arising from new incident infections and those who are undiagnosed prevalent cases that maybe we've identified through partner services. So you get diagnosed, you name an individual, they get diagnosed, your cluster has grown because you identified them. Now that's good. That's a positive public health outcome, because that cluster has grown, but we caused it to grow by identifying an unaware individual. Part of the major goal of all of this is to prevent incident infection, and we're not sure if we can do that. So predicting future cluster growth and disrupting future cluster growth are very different things. And the focus of my research right now is trying to address this question. So now I'm going to change gears for a little bit and talk about transmitted drug resistance, because people are always interested in it. That's the reason why these data were collected in the first place. The reason we have 150,000 genotype sequences in New York City isn't because a decade ago they foresaw that I would call them up and say, hey, can I start doing genetic analysis on your data? They wanted to know who was resistant, if these people who had drug resistance, if they were naive, and if is there evidence of transmitted drug resistance in their cohort? So what we wanted to know is, how is transmitted drug resistance propagating across the molecular transmission network? Now, the frequency of clustering in a network can indicate the transmission rate, or, given that, as Kate mentioned, I'm a trained evolutionary biologist, fitness. Now that's you have K. You have a K at position 103, and you have an N at position 103. K is susceptible to drug, N is resistant. And we want to know, is one of those more fit or less fit than the other? Now, we assume that drug resistance usually cause fitness decreases, and we'd like to see if we can see that across the transmission network by looking at the frequency of clustering of individuals with or without drug resistance mutations. So we looked at the clustering frequency in the ART naive cases in the US. This was done with CDC, so on the federal data set, and we see that we had 11,000 people who were ART naive and clustered in our network. And so that's a clustering rate of 38.7%. And if they had any drug resistance associated mutation at all, as classified under the CDC mutation list, which has about 100 or so different mutations, our clustering rate goes down to about 30%. So it looks like people with drug resistance cluster less frequency. Now remember, these are ART naive individuals, so we can remove previous exposure. And if we look at the different drug classes, NRTIs, NNRTIs, and PIs, we see that this this frequency of clustering changes with individuals with NRTIs, your K65Rs, your M184Vs. They cluster at the lowest frequency, which would suggest that NRTIs confer the greatest fitness decrease. But we wanted to go break this down by mutation. So we went, and here you can see our clusters over the network. These are all of our clusters that had more than 2/3 of the individuals in it with transmitted drug resistance. That's an individual here and an individual here who share that same drug resistance mutation. So this person was ART naive, this person is ART status unknown, and the red edge indicates that they share some drug resistance mutation. For this cluster, that's L90M. Now here we have people who don't share drug resistance mutations in this part of the cluster, but do share the same drug resistance mutation here. And you can see that most of these individuals are ART naive, just because the data set was enriched for that prior to 2010. So when we look at NRTIs, we see that these NRTIs decrease the rate of transmission, with T69N, M184V, and K65R having very, very low rates of clustering in the network. M184V clusters at 9% of the rate as M. So that's a very, very substantial decrease in fitness. K65R, we couldn't even say anything about, because there were only 13 people in our network that had a K65R mutation, but 0% of them clustered. So we think that these essentially really nasty drug resistance mutations that are effective against or detrimental to first-line therapy, they don't transmit well. So we don't see clusters of M184V and K65R. Only 6 people out of 169 who had M184V were linked to another ART naive person with M184V. So although we may see it, it's not being transmitted. And the exact opposite result was seen for L90M. L90M is a protease inhibitor effective against drugs that are certainly no longer first-line therapy. And we saw that they clustered at a rate, if you had M, you clustered at a rate of 48.4%, which is 26% higher than wild type. So that means that having an M increases the transmission fitness of your strain, or at least strains with an M have an increased transmission fitness, which might explain why we still see L90M mutations even though the drugs that would be selecting for them aren't being provided in large scale. And we saw something similar with K103N, which is still quite a relevant mutation, which had a relative fitness of 0.97, or not significantly different from wild type, which means strains with K and strains with N have about the same probability of transmitting across our network, which tells us that even if you remove the drug, this virus, this mutation may not be going anywhere. So to give you an idea, here is a cluster of L90M. This is a cluster of 80 people. Almost all of them are ART naive. I've marked the individuals who are ART experienced with E, but all of these Ns, those are ART naive individuals. And this L90M and T74S cluster dates back all the way to 2001. That means since 2001, this mutation has been propagating in a transmission cluster, and it has not reverted a single time, even when individuals have not been exposed to drug. It also means that all of these people who are ART experienced and have L90M, they didn't get L90M from treatment failure. They had L90M at the start of infection, and they just weren't characterized until they were ART experienced. We see the same thing happen with K103N. Here's a cluster that had been around for a decade, with K103N propagating among the people who are ART naive, and at some point transitioning into K103S, where then you see here's a cluster of K103S that continues to propagate among ART naive, unknown, and experienced individuals. So the experienced individuals here, that's not due to treatment failure. They have the same mutation that's been circulating for a decade. So M184V and K65R are selected against at the population level. This is really good news for PrEP and for first-line therapy. Clusters of K103N, Y181C, L90M persist even in the absence of drugs, which means once these mutations are in your population, they're not going to go away. So they are not ideal for therapy with regard to transmitted drug resistance. So this suggests we move away from the NRTI first-line therapy. And also just sort of a reminder that DRAMs and ART experienced individuals are frequently the result of transmitted drug resistance and not necessarily the result of poor treatment. Now, everything I've been talking about today is using HIV Trace, which is a program that we developed. It's a program that I brought to the CDC, and they were receptive to. But I'm just presenting results with a program that I developed, and you maybe would be suspicious of that because it's a very simple program. It's a simple-minded program, but it seems to work on very large data sets. So we published this about a year ago, and last month, the Swiss cohort, using much more sophisticated methods, essentially looking at clusters of transmitted drug resistance and in clusters of wild-type individuals, and looked at the transmission rates within those clusters using Bayesian phylogenomics and BEAST, so much more sophisticated programs than we use, and they looked at this exact same question. And here they found L90M has a higher fitness than wild type. They found that K103N has fitness indistinguishable from wild type, and they found that M184V has fitness significantly lower than wild type. So really fancy methods gave the exact same answer as our very simple-minded HIV trace approach. And when I saw these results, I breathed a huge sigh of relief for two reasons. One, we got ours out first, and second, the same results. Although they got in PLOS Pathogen, so I definitely didn't submit to the right journal. Anyway, so now sort of the important thing. We want to translate evolutionary biology into public health action, and how do we go about doing that? So pre-2018, there were 27 federally funded sites to collect HIV surveillance data. Starting January 1st, 2018, every state on this map now has to collect HIV surveillance genotype data and submit it to HIV Trace to run and build their transmission network analyses. So we're going to start moving forward with this. Now they're using Secure HIV Trace, which is available at secure.hivtrace.org, but not to anyone in this room. Sorry. Well, anyone here affiliated with the Maryland Public Health Department? Nope, no one in this room can use it. So it's only available to approved individuals at federally funded jurisdictions at the moment, where they can upload all of their data. Well, first they log in using their government ID and super secret password. And when they get in, they upload just a single CSV file containing all of the data extracted from EHARs, and it runs, and it builds them these networks automatically and colors them by risk factor, race, ethnicity, any demographic information that's collected in surveillance, and pretty soon we're going to start identifying priority clusters for them to go out on. So public health agencies in the US now have the ability to independently identify and act on HIV molecular transmission clusters near real time. We don't yet know if this is a scientifically advisable thing to do. We haven't evaluated the effect, but public health is moving forward with it anyway. Now, this is how I see molecular epi in public health departments. This is where animation would have been helpful. So this is me. This is not me. Because when I started doing this, I really thought that molecular epi would just be able to identify growing clusters, and if we knew which clusters were growing, we could go in and we could stop them, Captain America style. When I finally started talking with public health departments and visiting public health departments, this is what I found. This is what a public health department infrastructure looks like. And this piece here with 5 notches on it, that's molecular epidemiology, and that's how they see it. So the question is, how do we take what I think is a really interesting scientific advance and bring it into a bureaucratic organization whose goal is to improve public health, but has to exist within the current structure? And the answer is this. Molecular epidemiology can prioritize cases for standard surveillance, then it can prioritize more cases for standard services, and then finally, it can prioritize cases for standard services. And those 3 things are really important. And also, they should alleviate some of the scariness of molecular epi. Because those services that can be prioritized are, if you're a newly diagnosed index case, you can be linked to care. If you're a public health department that doesn't link every new case to care, now you can prioritize who you're linking to care. Because you already have a list of who's going to be linked to care, whether it's people with syphilis, whether it's people of a certain age or demographic or risk factor. Now we have another thing to help you prioritize these cases on your list. If you can't provide partner services to everyone, maybe you should prioritize people who are in clusters. Or as Kate was talking to me about earlier, maybe you should prioritize the people who aren't in clusters for partner services because you're missing their partners. We don't know, but we can investigate. And we can use the network to inform that. For the genetically linked cases, well, in the beginning we found that genetic linkage is a proxy for direct or indirect epidemiological relatedness, which is the same thing that partner naming is telling us. So if you're named an HIV positive and out of care, you go to the top of your return to care priority list. If you're genetically linked to a new index case and you're out of care, maybe you also go to the top of the out of care priority list. Maybe you get ART adherence support, although this is much more difficult than out of care. In our experience, when New York has gone out and someone who is viremic, but in care, the doctor tells them, please don't contact my patient. They know they're viremic. I know they're viremic. We're working on it. And if the public health department knocks on this guy's door, gives him a call, you're going to spook him, and he might then become out of care. So this is part of the puzzle piece, is figuring out which of these services are actually useful. You could do a partner services interview to a genetic partner if they never received it, or you could even do a partner services re-interview, which before I saw all this, I thought that was the gold mine. But then when I started talking to people in public health, they told me nobody ever gives any names on a second interview. So they might do it, but I don't have very many eggs in that basket. So what do we do in New York? Well, every month, New York City uses HIV Trace to find genetic partners of new HIV index cases diagnosed at STD clinics. They send me the data, I send them the links. We then direct their field services unit to the genetic partners who are out of care and virally suppressed. And currently we're monitoring their growth to see if services delivered in these growing clusters are effective at preventing newly diagnosed cases of HIV. And this is part of an R01 funded by NIH and NIAID. So we're just treating molecular epi like standard surveillance, and we're just going out and out of care people. So in that sense, we're really not interested in clusters. We're interested in genetic links and what that implies, and whether or not that can be used to do anything to improve public health in New York City. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my group, specifically Ben Merle and Manon Ragane, and the people in New York City, and Lucia Torian, who saw the potential of this work and tapped me to do this long before anyone else was interested, even before CDC. So a lot of credit to her. And then Sergey Kozakovsky-Pun and Stephen Weaver, who are the co-developers of HIV Trace and Secure HIV Trace and do all of the actual computer programming. And then, of course, Alexa Oster and her team at CDC. And then our funding from the NIH, who's bestowed on us K01, R21, and R01, from the CDC, UCSD CFAR, and Chirp and Gilead, who we also have a grant from. So with that, thank you for coming today, and let me know if you have any questions. No, sorry. Also, this is our group, and if you know anyone who wants to join it, I'm happy to chain them to a typewriter. So.
That was fantastic, and I just emphasize what a cool thing it is to have watched this develop into a real public health tool from sort of people working on transparencies on overhead projectors in the basement of the math department 25 years ago. But in terms of formalizing the tool, you have a pre-specified distance threshold that you use. One can imagine an abstraction where you take the locus that's being uploaded, align that to a reference set, get the distribution of distances using whatever distance method you choose, whatever distance model you choose, find the value between the first mode and the second, and set that as a cutoff dynamically, so that if you happen to generalize the tool to say Hep C or some other virus, then you could be agnostic about what that distance threshold is. And you could also imagine a future world when you keep on accumulating data and your confidence about that breakpoint improves.
Yes. So within HIV Trace, within sort of the transmission cluster engine, you are able to set any threshold you want and explore the data. The reason we've given it a fixed cutoff and not given public health departments the ability to essentially change it is because we've explored across HIV across the United States in the surveillance setting, and this is where we feel comfortable setting it, and we essentially wanted to take the choice away from the user. But your bigger point is absolutely correct. When we've gone into hepatitis C, we've essentially had to look across a range of cutoffs to see which one is giving us the best sort of signal-to-noise ratio, and to go about this in a dynamic fashion, I think is definitely doable. I think from a surveillance guidance standpoint, we're very comfortable with our choice of fixed, but you're absolutely right. And I think more to the point, what I presented as sort of the best predictors of cluster growth, this is not, I would never consider that to be sort of the end-all be-all. Right now the question is if we can find some top priority, regardless of how clusters are defined, regardless of how, what method is used, they should be similar across methodologies. And actually Oliver did a comparison of HIV Trace to another clustering tool and found that in general they were giving us very similar answers. So it's really a question of, are you capturing that top priority slice? And I mean, no result that you don't see across sort of a range of these distance thresholds. If you only see it at one threshold and not another, and not a more conservative threshold, then I wouldn't believe it.
And a more focused follow-on question. So when you vary the evolutionary model with more parameters, what happens to that breakpoint position on the histogram?
Nothing. So this is the great thing about, so we used TN93, which is a fairly simplistic model, not the simplest, not the most complicated, but as Sergey says, it's the most complicated model that can be solved with a closed form solution, so you don't have to do any likelihood optimization. But for any genetic distance less than 0.5%, less than 5%, nothing makes a difference. JC69, GTR plus gamma, codon model, it's all going to tell you the same because you just don't have enough reversions or multiple hits for it to make any difference. Once you get above 5%, if you don't include gamma, your estimates are way off. But because we're just interested in those 1.5% thresholds, counting would probably be just as good. I mean, you have to adjust slightly, but yeah. So we've we can do a lot of cheats because we don't get indels and the distances are so low. That's why HIV trace works. It's a great question, though.
Thank you very much for sharing beautiful work. And I was particularly interested in the whole thing, but particularly I loved your third part that talked about the translation to public health. And even more specifically, the slide where you showed the puzzle, because I work closely with the Baltimore City Health Department, and truly that is the reality, which is just this 5-point small little piece in a much bigger bureaucracy. So I have one comment, and then I'll finally get to a question. But so we probably 3-4 years ago started using viral load with the city health department to prioritize cases for follow-up in the absence of something else, but actually as a good biomarker of transmission. And we developed 2 different protocols, much like you did, or at least the first part, which is going after prioritizing cases. And that had resonance, particularly when we started talking about prioritizing those cases like a congenital syphilis case, because that was something they were familiar with, and that seemed to resonate. Then we also had a different protocol, and that one actually didn't work very well for reasons I could get into, but not. We instead used place and venues, and I think you heard a little bit about the venue work earlier in a meeting, to think about clusters in space and time. And that so far has been working a little better. But again, so what I'm curious about is in real time in the New York City, and I imagine you're not sitting in real time with the New York City Health Department, but you're feeding them data in real time. What does it really look like in real time? How often are they giving you sequences, and are they working those, and are you getting data back to look at about how it's going? And because the real-time component is a whole nother beast. Yes,
and that feeds into if we can identify a growing cluster, can we do anything about it? And that's not just our interventions effective, but are they delivered in a timely enough fashion to make a difference? So New York City Field Services Unit, so they send me sequences at the start of every month. Okay. And over the last year and a half, we've gotten 450 index cases. So usually about 20 a month or so. And I run the analysis and I get it back to them the same day.
Yeah.
And I said, look, I can do this. Every time you have a new case, you can send it to me, and I can tell you who they're linked to, and you can have it within 24 hours. And they said, no. Yeah. FSU meets once a month. And every month, we give all of our DIS officers a list of people that they're responsible for going out on that month. You could send us a list every week, and we'll keep that in a stack, and then we'll bring them to them next month. So that could change, but right now, that's what real time is in New York City,
Yeah,
because that's how they do prioritization, and that's how they do out of care prioritization. That's how they do ART suppression support prioritization. Your point about incorporating lab data, and we're starting to look at CD4 and viral load and how that feeds into this. And essentially to build sort of our best prediction model, I think, sort of dynamic viral load and CD4 counts. But yeah, I mean, CD4 and viral load is already used to prioritize, higher viral load, you get viremia support. Shorter time out of care, you get return to care support. And so trying to find sort of the algorithm to bring that and combine that with clustering and how that all works.
Quick comment. You did a great job of touching on the ethics and how careful you are about security. I would just emphasize that when you move toward real-time reporting, especially when you get to small numbers, from an enterprise data privacy point of view, you become a risk. It becomes a risk. So, for instance, if somebody has a camera on the health department's front door and they somehow sniff your data feed and they see positives coming out, that's how data get aggregated. Yeah. So the more real time you get, the more vulnerable you become to being compromised.
That's a good thing to keep in mind.
So be very careful about granular feeds become susceptible.
Okay, that's a good thing to consider. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay.
All right, well, thank you all for coming today, and I appreciate it.